We are following a devastating new chapter in an already horrifying case. It involves a woman named Sydne Graf. She's a fifth grade math teacher in Kentucky, and you might remember this story. She was first arrested after police intercepted her, allegedly on her way to pick up a student under the age of 12, a student that she had allegedly been sending sexually explicit messages to. But now this story gets even worse because a grand jury has handed up a new indictment that completely changes this story. It accuses her of something far, far worse. And this is no longer just about sick messages on a screen. It is about the most unthinkable actions. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. As a parent, I think about my kids' futures a lot. And in this line of work, we come across stories that do make you worry about the long term. Now, life insurance is not something that is fun to think about, but this year you can take care of the important stuff by having a policy that means your family is protected so you can have peace of mind. Fabric by Gerber Life is term life insurance you can get done today. It's made for busy parents like you, online, on your schedule, right from your couch. So you could be covered in 10 minutes with no health exam required. If you have a family, the time to lock in one of Fabric's policies is now. They're high quality and flexible to fit your family's budget. Join thousands of parents who trust Fabric to protect their family. You can apply today in minutes at meetfabric.com/OTC. That is MEET fabric.com/OTC. You might remember the fifth grade math teacher, Sydne Graf. She stood in a Kentucky courtroom in a jail jumpsuit. She was weeping. She was saying no as the judge talked about the charges against her. This was the first time we covered this story at the end of last year. Graf was there facing charges for what police called some stomach-churning, sexually explicit conversations that she allegedly had with one of her own students. We're talking about a boy under the age of 12. Authorities said they intercepted Graf as she arrived to pick that child up. And at that point, the charges that we knew about, it was just about conversation. Not that that is any better than anything else, but the charges were about what she was allegedly saying to this student through online messaging.
The allegations here are certainly extremely serious, extremely concerning, related to the alleged contact with the juvenile in question.
I'll be honest, because now what we know about this case and what prosecutors say they have on this teacher, she certainly has infinitely more reasons to cry. Because right now, Sydne Graf is facing some new charges from a grand jury indictment, and they are shocking to say the least. The new charges include first-degree rape of a child under the age of 12. She's also facing a charge of first-degree sodomy of a child under 12. The original case was just about words on a screen, but this new indictment, it alleges actions. So how did this nightmare all unfold? Well, I want you to picture this. It's a normal school day in Louisville, Kentucky, but it's not a school day in the traditional sense. In fact, it's what's called non-traditional instruction. So students aren't in the classroom. It's kind of like remote learning when you think back to COVID times. Now, the non-traditional day means that kids are learning from home on their computers. And one of those kids is a fifth grade boy. We're talking about a boy under the age of 12. And his teacher that day in math is 36-year-old Sydne Graf. Sydne Graf is married. She's also a mother of two. And by all accounts, from her social media, she is the kind of teacher who passionately fundraised for new flexible classroom seating, calling her students, quote, the brightest, most kind-hearted children. On the surface, this is the kind of teacher that as a parent you want for your child, the person who realizes that students deserve better, and they're going to do everything it takes to make sure those students get everything they need to learn successfully. That's what it appeared Sydne Graf was doing. But according to police, on that remote learning day, the communication between teacher and student took a sickening turn because this was no longer about math. This was no longer about anything that should be involved with school. The school district's police first got wind of it. They contacted Louisville Metro Police. Then detectives dove in, and what they reportedly found was appalling to say the least. Explicit sexual chats. One message is even detailed word for word in the police report, which we have, and I'll read that for you here in a moment. And that line, it is graphic, and it is incredibly disturbing. And if true, it is incredibly damning when it comes to the evidence against this teacher. But now we are learning that it didn't stop at talking. Police say that the conversation moved to making plans. It was a meetup. And on December 15th, according to the arrest report, Sydne Graf followed through. She drove to the area of that boy's house to pick him up, according to police. But when she got there, police were waiting. They apprehended her right then and there. And after being read her rights, according to police, she allegedly admitted to having those graphic conversations with the student. And they also found pills in her car. And that led to a drug possession charge. So her initial charges were about procuring a minor electronically, essentially using digital means to solicit a child. She was arrested, and the next day she stood in front of a judge.
The allegations here are certainly extremely serious, extremely concerning, related to the alleged contact with the juvenile in question, and then certainly of additional concern are the allegations that there were then not just contact that was electronic in nature, but then arrangements being made to meet the juvenile, and looks like there were actual attempts of picking up that juvenile from his residence.
Graf posted that bond, and she was released, but she did have to adhere to some strict conditions. And the case was then sent to a grand jury to see if more charges were warranted. And again, at that point, it was our understanding on the outside that this case really just centered around those online conversations that she allegedly had with that student. But that was then, and this is now. What that grand jury decided has completely redefined the scope of this case. Frankly, the scope of this tragedy, when you think about the impact that this type of alleged behavior has on young people. That grand jury has now spoken. And the new indictment does not just add to the charges, it transforms the entire nature of the case. So forget the initial charge of procuring a minor electronically. The charge is still there, but it has now been buried under an avalanche of far more serious allegations. This week, according to court documents obtained by People magazine and the local station WDRB, Sydne Graf was indicted on the following new charges: first-degree rape of a child under 12 years old, first-degree sodomy of a child under 12 years old, unlawful transaction with a minor, illegal sexual activity, and possession of a controlled substance. Her bond has now skyrocketed. It was $100,000, and then she posted that. But now with these new charges, it is at $500,000, according to People. And if she was somehow able to post that because she is now back in the custody of the jail, the conditions that she faces will be very strict. She will have absolutely no contact with the alleged victim or any minors unless supervised. And to understand the gravity of where all of this started, you do have to go back to the original police report. So I want to read you a key part of it. This is from the Louisville Metro Police, and it reads, quote, "Detectives were contacted by JCPS Police, the school police, in relation to the exploitation of a juvenile victim. And it was reported that during a non-traditional workday, a fifth grade math teacher engaged in sexual conversations with a fifth grade student. The conversations discuss sexual activities with the suspect, stating, 'I really need to taste,' and then there's an explicit term, FR, which is slang for real, for real. The suspect made arrangements to meet the juvenile victim on today's date. The suspect was apprehended while picking up the juvenile victim from the area of his residence. The victim at the time of offense was under the age of 12. Post Miranda, the suspect admitted to the previously mentioned conversations." Now, for years, Sydne Graf presented a very specific and very trusted public image. She was a dedicated fifth grade math teacher at Smyrna Elementary School in Louisville, Kentucky, and on social media, she was the passionate educator. She was fundraising for her, quote, dream classroom. She wrote just last year, quote, "I teach fifth grade math at the best school in the entire world. My students are some of the brightest, most kind-hearted children I have ever had the privilege of teaching." You read that line, then you compare it to what the line police say she sent that student, and it's just shocking. This teacher was a fixture. In 2024, the school even featured her in a post excited for the new year with her, quote, "feisty fourth graders" before she moved with them up to fifth grade. Now, offline, it seems like she built a life that was anchored in responsibility. She was married. She had 2 kids of her own, young children. This was the persona, the trusted mentor, the community figure, the caring parent. It's a devastating reminder that The ultimate breach of trust can wear a familiar face if these allegations turn out to be true. It's a story that we have covered many times. And sadly, it feels like there's always a new case like this that is coming up. The teacher, the mentor who presented such a trusting public persona. And then there's the reality that police say was really going on behind the scenes that can have an impact on a young person for a lifetime. All right, joining us now to talk more about this is former sex crimes prosecutor Dan Shore. Always great to have you at Law&Crime. We talked about this when Sydne Graf was first charged, and this was at the time when law enforcement believed, to our knowledge, that she was just having this inappropriate communication with a student who she was doing a remote learning with, and then they arrest her allegedly in the direction of going to this child's home. Now it appears, based off the charges that have been filed, that she did allegedly have physical contact with this young student. I mean, certainly it's a more serious charge that she's now facing. But from the prosecution standpoint, I mean, how does that change the dynamic of this case going forward?
Well, it's a much more serious charge that she's charged with. I believe one of the charges is rape of a child under the age of 12, another sodomy of a child under the age of 12. And those types of charges are much more serious than what we knew about before, which was communication of a sexualized nature, going to meet that person, that underage student, and that was presumed to be for the purpose of having some sexual liaison. Those are obviously serious charges, but it's a whole nother level to actually have had sexual interaction, sex with someone who is underage. And it's not just underage, it's a fifth grader. So it's extremely underage. And usually state laws, in terms of the seriousness of the crime, it's based on how young the person is. And the younger they are, the more serious of a crime it is, for understandable reasons.
And so she's this fifth grade math teacher. She's a married mom of two. And then it's a remote learning day. So she's communicating with her students through a computer or tablet of some sort. And then that's where law enforcement kind of gets this ping that like these terms are being used. And then they arrest her and they believe that she was headed in the direction of that student's home. When you look at this, the communication part of it, because remote learning, was not something when I was in school. That's kind of a post-COVID new reality. But in cases you investigate, and I know that you now work on the civil side, I guess, like, how has remote learning actually impacted the types of cases that we're now seeing like this?
Well, it allows people to reach out to people when they're not in school. And a lot of times the contact outside of school leads to the opportunity to engage in inappropriate behavior with people. So, when you went to school, when I went to school, you go to school in the morning, you leave at the end of the day. And that was pretty much your contact with the teacher. I don't remember ever having contact with a teacher except for rare occasions after school ended. Now it's common to some days you're doing things remotely, you're communicating, people are texting, people are connecting on social media. And when I advise schools, I'm always discouraging all of that there should be no communication between teachers and students, especially students this young, other than through school platforms during school hours. But unfortunately, people abuse that, and we start to see text messages that can escalate. So it's more of an opportunity to do things unmonitored, when you could write directly to someone and they can write back to you and you could connect without other people knowing about it. Often the parents are working, they may be working in the home, they may be working outside the home, but there's not the type of monitoring as there is when someone's in a classroom.
And I think back to her first court appearance, and I just remember like how emotional she was, and it was almost like shaking her head, like, "No, I didn't do it." And it's hard to read the body. Body language can be so subjective, and as far as what she was kind of saying with that emotion, it's really only she knows. But according to the arrest documents that we have, she did admit to having some sort of explicit conversation with this boy. To our knowledge, she didn't admit to having physical interaction with a victim, which is what she's now accused of. If you're a prosecutor on this case, do you read into that she was not being honest with you when you were questioning her, or law enforcement was having a conversation with her about what she's accused of doing?
It's very possible that she did not admit to other crimes that she was engaged in, but I think it's really important to always remember that she has a right to remain silent. She's innocent until proven guilty. So I think most people, if they're questioned by law enforcement about certain allegations, they're not going to then on their own say, "Oh, and by the way, I also did this with this child," which is much worse. It's just not how someone who is interviewed by law enforcement generally responds, nor should we expect them to, nor do they have a legal obligation to. So I don't think it'd be held against this teacher at all for not disclosing that earlier. But those early charges, which she did admit to, or she didn't admit to the criminal charges, but she admitted to some of the conduct. They included text messages that law enforcement has released. So unless she's going to say those text messages, which are extremely explicit about engaging in sexual interactions with this underage student, unless she's going to say those texts are not from her, they're either fabricated or someone else did it to make it look like her, then you kind of have to admit to that part of it. But it's another series of events, or at least one event, where she's now accused of actual sexual interaction with a fifth grader. And that's another level, as we've said. But I'm not surprised that she didn't on her own come out with it. And she can't be punished by the judicial system just for not disclosing that. She has the right to not disclose that.
And when it comes to, I'm so blown away. I always am with any of these. I think everybody is, right? I mean, this is a woman who privately, or, in her personal life, is a married mother of two,
Yeah.
according to media reports. She's a fifth grade teacher, and it's not like any age it's okay. If a child is under 18, or that teacher student relationship. But the line that has been released of what she said, and it's explicit, but she ends it with FRFR, which in a much younger demographic is for real than the language that I'm sure you and I use on a regular basis. But to me, that kind of just says that she's trying to level with this kid, that she's trying to communicate on his level. Like, as someone who has prosecuted cases like this, like, how do you read into that dynamic of here she is trying to speak his language, as she is what she's accused of doing, almost, being a predator and trying to get on this kid's level and gain that trust.
Yeah. And look, people our age may not be texting with that language, but part of my work every day is investigating these types of cases. And I see way too many text messages between people in these situations. So I'm familiar with the way that the grooming process often works in these cases. That's a big part of sexual abuse of with a teacher. An underage student is trying to ingratiate yourself with them first to get them to trust you, get their parents to trust you, and writing in their language, writing in colloquialisms, writing all abbreviations. That's part of it. You don't. I hardly ever see in my cases someone who's a teacher just come out of nowhere and start engaging in sexual interactions with a student. Almost always there's this long lead up of grooming behavior, boundary blurring behavior, trying to make sure that you can isolate someone, making sure that they're not going to report these small steps, and then feeling emboldened to then engage in actual sexual interaction. So I think that's what that's about. It's about the grooming process, which is common in these cases.
And speaking of being emboldened, I mean, it's just so brazen to say this to a child, and then to allegedly act upon it. And I know that this is the question that we often ask in these stories, and there's never really an answer, but it's like, how does this happen? Like, how does a married mom of two eventually get to the point where she is allegedly texting that line to a fifth grade student?
Right. Well, as far as the married mother of two part of it, I mean, we've talked about a lot of these cases, and a lot of the people who are doing this kind of misconduct are married with children. We see that over and over again. I don't know if that's a function of them being unhappy in their life, in their marriage, but obviously someone is not mentally well adjusted if they're going to engage in sexual interactions with their student who's a fifth grader. But it happens, and I think I've talked about this before with you. It's often the people that you trust the most that can get away with this type of misconduct. A fifth grade female teacher who seems like a nice teacher is not going to raise any red flags on the part of the parents of the student when they see them interacting if they don't see the specific language of the text. People are not going to suspect their fifth grade teacher, usually, especially a female teacher, just because that's not how parents often think about these situations. Even though we see these cases all the time, most parents feel comfortable in that situation. So I think they're able to then engage in it. Why would someone do that? Not only is there the moral part of it, but there's also the self-preservation part of it that is really bewildering, because she's putting her life on the line, her career, her freedom. She could be incarcerated. She's putting all that on the line based on allegedly interactions with a fifth grader. And to take that risk in your life, besides obviously the horrendous moral implications of what she's doing, that is something that it's hard to wrap your head around why someone would do that.
And I know, every state is a little different when it comes to charges and what that can mean when it comes to sentencing. But in terms of her situation, and it was originally sending some allegedly very bad messages to a fifth grade student, to now being accused of actually having physical interaction with a student who is that young. In terms of what the punishment could be, I guess, and I know you were in New York, but like, I guess what's the difference there between, like, it's obviously terrible what she was accused of doing the first time we talked about this, but now here she is, facing a reality where I would assume prison time would be significantly longer for something like this.
Well, absolutely. The charges here are rape of a child under 12, sodomy of a child under 12. Usually that involves some kind of penetration, whether it's sexual intercourse, oral sex, or both. So for someone to do that, who's a teacher who's 30 in their 30s with a fifth grader, if she's convicted of that, I'd be shocked if she doesn't get substantial state prison in response to that. She would probably get some incarceration for just the messages that we knew about before, but this is very, very different in terms of the consequences for her, and also the trauma consequences for a student who's in fifth grade and experiences this if what happened is along the lines of what's alleged here.
I think about right now, the school district has had her, the term I'm just looking at, WIKY TV says that she's been reassigned to not have contact with students while the investigation unfolds. In some cases, we see teachers fired on the spot. In other cases, they are put on leave without pay. In this case, it appears that she was reassigned. Like, why is the dynamic different depending on the school district? And I'm sure there's a civil part of this as well, but just typically, what do you see as the reason why in some cases teachers are fired right on the spot and others are kind of pushed to the side as an investigation's ongoing?
Well, I believe she worked for a public school system, and usually for the public school systems under a sexual assault allegation type of investigation, they need to go through their process, find someone either responsible or law enforcement convicts them, or there's some type of resolution to the process before they can actually remove someone and fire them. So a lot of times people are just reassigned where they might not be doing any work at all. They may be on paid leave. I've seen that happen. I think the situations where we see someone fired immediately tend to be more private schools that have more freedom and they're less bound by public contracts and unions. And they may not be taking federal funds, so they may not have Title IX regulations overseeing them. So those private schools they have much more freedom to just cut someone loose and fire them. But public schools, as is the case here, tend to have to go through a long process before they can remove somebody.
And it just comes to, I just keep thinking about that one specific line that's been released, and we don't know what other text messages, how long this grooming process was going, what type of relationship that she had with maybe the student, the family of that student, and how long that went on for. But typically, I mean, in cases, and this is just a general question, when it comes to grooming, like, how long does the grooming process typically last or go in cases that you've seen? I mean, is there a timeline, frankly, with what it takes for a teacher to gain the level of trust that this eventually is that situation that happens?
Yeah, it really varies. And we've seen it go on for years of a grooming process till someone actually engages in some type of sexual interactions. I mean, the text here, I won't read it, it's very explicit, but it refers very explicitly to having oral sex, of her performing oral sex on him. Now, there's no way that this teacher just came out of casual, normal conversations as a teacher and then wrote that. So I think by the explicit nature of it, we could assume there were precursor comments that were part of the grooming process. Even a teacher who is sexually abusing someone and doesn't have the judgment to not do that, I've never seen them just write something like that. They're going to be boundary blurring behavior, and that could be physical, that could be, hugs, kisses on the cheeks, just things like that get someone closer to somebody. But it could go on for a long time. I think that, especially if someone, we don't know, there's no allegation here that this defendant is a repeat offender, but in the cases that I've investigated where they are, often they learn from past situations of this is how to groom somebody. And we've seen victims talk about how they were groomed in very similar ways, sometimes across different years. So I think that it really depends on the situation. But unfortunately, there's a common pattern that I see in really tragic cases.
Yeah. And in this case, it's just incredibly tragic. A lot of unknowns at this point as far as all the details that led to these new charges, and a lot of just on how long this must have allegedly been going on to get to this point. It's always shocking whenever we talk about these cases. Former sex crimes prosecutor Dan Shore, it's always great to have you on Law&Crime. I know that you also, as an author, write about issues like this, which is really important for people to kind of understand it. I certainly have learned a lot in the times that we've talked together. And your book, Open Bars Out, where can people find it?
Sure. Open Bar is a political thriller. It's a novel, and it's based on sexual abuse allegations involving educational institutions just like this. I based it on my real life experience. You could go to Amazon, any bookstore, or find me on Substack, and you could learn more about that book. Thanks.
All right. Dan Shore, thanks for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
According to online court records, Sydne Graf is next expected to be in court next month. That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law&Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and now you can find episodes of On the Case on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.